Hey, welcome everybody to Conduct Detrimental. This is your co-host, Daniel Wallach. Joining me today is Michael Lawson, who's a member of the Conduct Detrimental team and occasional co-host. Mike is a litigator and a lawyer up in Albany, New York. And today we're going to have a sports betting theme on our episode. We are blessed to have as our guest today for a kind of a freewheeling interview on a lot of topics in sports betting. We're going to be joined by Joe Asher. Joe Asher is one of the most pivotal and central figures in the expansion of sports betting in the United States. He was the chief executive officer of William Hill US, and he was one of the prime movers and shakers behind the scenes in bringing the New Jersey sports betting case to a head. Today, he's the president of the sports betting division of IGT. And we're going to cover a lot of topics today. For those who've closely been following the debate on legal sports betting, we recently had an anniversary on May 14th. It had been 4 years since the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act was overturned by the United States Supreme Court. And that law was the primary obstacle to the expansion of sports betting throughout the United States. And we're going to talk to Joe about the New Jersey case, his role in it, and talk about some of the central developments over the course of that 4-year litigation. And then we're going to bring it forward and discuss with him some of the current topics and current legal issues around the sports betting industry. So Mike, thanks for joining me today. I know we both love the sports betting issues and the topic. And Joe is one of the most knowledgeable people in the industry, and he's been at the forefront of so many key developments. So I think we're going to have fun today going through these many topics with Joe. So welcome aboard, Mike. It's great to co-host our second show together.
Second, yeah, we did a legislative roundup a few weeks ago covering some of the recent legislations and the potential for the legalization of sports betting. And I'm excited too. I mean, Joe Asher is an absolute legend in this field, and that he was right at the beginning of the legalization of sports gambling, and has worked in numerous different companies and William Hill, and now he's with IGT. And he definitely has a lot to say, and he's got a lot of knowledge on this. But this podcast is sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. Underdog Fantasy is really the best and easiest way for you to play fantasy sports. I mean, you have super easy to use mobile app, and the website is really user friendly. And right now, if you sign up with the code CONDUCT, you'll double your first deposit. They'll match up to $100. So if you use the code CONDUCT, CONDUCT, they'll match up to $100 of your first deposit. And we're in prime time right now for sports. We've got playoffs for the NHL, we've got playoffs for the NBA, we've got MLB in full swing, and they really have these easy pick'em games where you can just go on and pick just over-unders. And it's really, really simple, really easy to use. Head over to Underdog Fantasy Sports.
Well, speaking of underdogs, there was probably no greater underdog for many years in the state of New Jersey in the Christie 1, the Christie 2 case, ultimately the Murphy case. We're going to sort of take a walk down memory lane with Joe and really dive into the NCAA versus Christie litigations, which were Christie 1 and Christie 2. And as Joe brings out on the episode, New Jersey lost 7 times in a row. They lost at the district court in Christie 1. They lost at the appellate court in Christie 1. Supreme Court denied cert. That there were other pretrial motions. So they were shut out in Christie 1, and in Christie 2, they were being shut out. And, the great Ted Olson, one of the most historically significant lawyers in U.S. history, lost 7 rulings in a row and ultimately won before the United States Supreme Court. So you don't need to have a 500 record in order to make the Sports Betting Hall of Fame. You just need to win the most important case. And Joe was, for many years, and still in my mind, the voice of the U.S. sports betting industry. He was there at the beginning, and he was so closely associated with the gaming industry that if you were going to a gaming conference or reading a newspaper article at any point about this issue between 2012 and 2018, he was being quoted in it. He was probably the best spokesperson for the industry and one of the most knowledgeable and central figures in this debate. So we're going to have him on today to really celebrate the 4-year anniversary of PASPA being overturned. So without further ado, let's kick it over to our interview with the one and only Joe Asher. It is my pleasure to welcome to Conduct Detrimental one of the most pivotal and central figures in the growth of the legalized sports betting industry in the United States, the one and only Joe Asher, president of IGT Sports Betting Division, and as many people may recall, the CEO of William Hill US, behind the scenes, one of the big movers and shakers in the push to legalize sports betting in the US. Joe, how are you?
Doing great, Dan. Good to be with you.
Thanks. You know, I've often wanted to do a sort of a little bit of a retrospective on the Christie/Murphy case. You know, we're only 9 days, I believe, removed from the 4th-year anniversary of the U.S. Supreme Court overturning the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act in a sweeping, or at least a majority decision. Do you remember what you were doing at 10 a.m. on the morning of May 14th, 2018?
Sure. I was actually home on the treadmill, and, we'd been thinking that, for any number of Mondays, I guess, that the result might be coming. I think somebody texted me that the result was out or something like that. It's always a bit of a flurry, because then I started getting a lot of phone calls and texts, and you actually had to spend a little bit of time to read the opinion, right? Because if you just go to the last page, as you know, as a lawyer, that, it gives you the reversed or affirmed, but you really need to get into the opinion to figure out what's going on. So anyway, it turned into obviously a pretty hectic day as we first, tried to digest what was in the opinion to understand what the court had ruled. And then, starting very quickly, actually, to make plans to start sports betting in New Jersey. In fact, I caught a very early morning flight the next day. We had a little celebration that evening and on the plane very early the next morning.
Do you recall where you celebrated? I missed out on that one.
We did. We were at the Sahara in Las Vegas, site of one of the William Hill sports books owned by Alex Morello. And we put together an impromptu party for a number of employees. And it was we're all happy, of course, with the result. But I will say that the enthusiasm was a bit tempered by the fact that we understood there's going to be an awful lot of work that was going to be starting early the next morning. So it wasn't one of these, go out and have a great time and you don't have to worry about anything. It was a bit tempered by the understanding of what was to come.
You weren't a newcomer to the litigation around sports betting. You go back to Delaware's efforts in 2009 to expand their sports betting lottery offerings to include single game sports wagering. So can you describe how that served as the sort of the impetus for you getting involved in, meeting Dennis Drazen in New Jersey, how that led you to having, sort of an involvement in the New Jersey sports betting case from your outpost in Las Vegas?
Well, I mean, the 2009 case was about the scope of Delaware's exemption under PASPA, or the scope of the grandfather clause. And it was fairly unique because it only affected a handful of states. I remember, of course, very clearly when we won in the district court in Delaware and then lost in the Court of Appeals. And it was a pretty deflating day, to be sure. But it never addressed the merits of whether or not PASPA itself was constitutional, right? The Delaware litigation was only about the scope of Delaware's exemption. There was no challenge to the statute as a whole. And so, it wasn't too long after that. I think I, started speaking with Dennis and got in touch with Dennis. And of course, the trials and tribulations of the New Jersey sports betting case have been written about extensively and so forth, but probably no one more pivotal to all of that than Dennis. All credit to Governor Christie, of course, who was the governor and the named plaintiff for so long and who kept persevering loss after loss. But, it was quite a team of people who were really pursuing that New Jersey sports betting case. And, you have to give a lot of credit, frankly, to Governor Christie for hiring Ted Olson at the outset, right? When the litigation started, he did not do it any other way than, hiring the best lawyer that you can find for something like this in Ted, who obviously ultimately prevailed.
I remember for a long time, we read these articles about how much money the state of New Jersey was paying in legal fees to Ted Olson, almost like there was this narrative being created that the state was basically throwing all this money away on a losing bet. It turned out to be the best return on investment you could have ever hoped for.
And I'm not sure, the money may have been coming from, sort of a casino industry fund as well. I'm not sure where the money to pursue the litigation, where within the state accounts it came from. But it was a long, hard road, and it's a great lesson in perseverance, right? Depending on how you count it. New Jersey was 0-7, 0-8 at some point, and then they won the one time that ultimately mattered. And you had Dennis, who was the guy who was really, the mastermind of the revised New Jersey law, right? It's kind of almost forgotten, of course, that at one point in time when the Third Circuit ruled against New Jersey and, Governor Christie, I think, basically said it was time to give up and move on. And then there was a new bill that was passed. And, that ultimately was what went to the Supreme Court. And that's kind of almost like a forgotten footnote in the whole thing. But, Dennis never gave up.
Well, it's interesting you said that because I read an interview in which you described attending a speech given by Governor Chris Christie in 2011, where he talked about legalized sports betting. And you said you liked how he answered the question about his interaction with a New York Giants fan who was on the one hand happy that the Giants, won the game against Miami 20-17, but it was sort of a split verdict from his perspective because he didn't win on the parlay bet he had made. And you liked how Christie answered that, and it led you to call Dennis out of the blue. Can you kind of describe your initial impressions of Dennis and how the two of you, got together and what sold you on him?
Yeah, well, the speech that you talked about, or the talk that you talked about, was at the University of Delaware, where Governor Christie was a graduate, and so am I, and for that matter, so is the president. But us Blue Hens are a proud group. But he gave that little story about the fan, and they won, but they didn't cover, or the guy lost his parlay, whatever it was. It wasn't that long afterwards that I tracked down Dennis's phone number and just cold called him and introduced myself and told him that I wanted to come out and visit with him. And he said, sure. And I went and visited him in his box at Monmouth Park because, Dennis is the operator of Monmouth Park for the New Jersey Thoroughbred Horsemen Association. He had a horse running that day and the horse won. So I thought that was probably going to be a good omen. It was a first-time starter, I think, or at least a maiden. And I thought that was a good omen. But over the course of lunch, they got really good crab cakes at Monmouth Park. There were two things, actually, that became crystal clear in a very shortly after meeting Dennis. Number one, this guy was very, very smart. And number two, he was never going to give up. He would never give up. And, look, I practiced law for a number of years at a big law firm and dealt with a lot of very smart people. And so, I've been around, really smart people. And it was pretty clear Dennis was exceptionally bright. He was willing to just keep going and going and going and going until ultimately his position prevailed. And so, those two things were evident at the outset. And then that's what led to William Hill doing a deal with Monmouth, where I think we put up $1 million and built a sports bar with the idea that would one day become a sports book. And I had no idea, if that meant it was going to be a sports book in 2012 or 2013 or 2015 or 2018 like it became, or 2025, right? Had no idea when it was going to happen, but, was pretty confident that one day it would.
Well, you mentioned that your perception on Dennis was that he wasn't the type that was ever going to give up. And he was also he started strong by having his horse win that day. So it served as a positive omen. But the New Jersey case took on a completely opposite dimension. You started losing after losing after losing. And that resolve at some point must have been tested. Was there ever a point at which you said, well, this is it, we're going to have to turn our attention to Congress? Certainly, when you had the Supreme Court deny certiorari, and then the next day, the legislature introduces that partial repeal law that attempts to repeal state law prohibitions on sports betting only at tracks and state licensed casinos. And then Governor Christie vetoes that bill. So at that point, how close was your team and your sort of the stakeholders, how close were you to pulling the plug? And what changed over the course of that summer leading into September of 2014 that made you think Governor Christie would change his mind?
Well, look, there was nothing for us to plug on, right? We had already, made the deal to build out the sports bar. So that was already done. And so there wasn't really anything for us to pull the plug on. And, simultaneously with the New Jersey litigation, there were discussions going on around what might be able to be done in Congress, and the AGA, the American Gaming Association, under the leadership of Jeff Freeman and Sarah Slane, had really started, I think, to do just really good work in establishing relationships with the sports leagues and the media companies to start to take away some of the mystery, I think, for the leagues, right? Because there really hadn't been any conversation at a significant level between, bookmakers and the sports leagues, right? There had been some interaction with the gaming industry per se, but I made the point early on in my discussions with some of the folks at the leagues that, look, we share an office building with Wells Fargo and New York Life. It's just a typical office environment, to try to do away from the mystique of, the smoke-filled dark room, the guy with, the hairy chest and the shirt unbuttoned halfway down and the cigar in his mouth, right? So I think there was a lot of that sort of work that the AGA did that was impactful. And I recall, the first time I ever met Jeff was at a restaurant called Bistro B in Washington, D.C. I'd been in Delaware, took the train down to meet him. And, historically, the role of the AGA had really been largely to prevent bad things from happening in the gaming industry. And sports betting represented an opportunity for the AGA to do something affirmatively positive for its members. I thought it was an issue that would really unite the industry, and the industry could unite behind. And Jeff did such a good job with it. And so you had that all going on at the same time the litigation's happening. And then, I think just a couple of days before the oral argument, George Will, who, very highly regarded conservative columnist, basically wrote an op-ed piece saying that PASPA should be overturned. And so you started to see this, certainly lack of opposition, if not outright support, from members of the public at large and folks in Congress or in state legislatures. And I think, all those things helped create the environment which led to the opinion.
The NFL, the NBA, and the major professional sports leagues were still vehemently opposed to your efforts to try to, overturn PASPA or to win in court. How much of their opposition was rooted in a desire to avoid what they would fear would be a patchwork of state regulations with a regulatory race to the bottom? They're sort of messaging on that versus wanting to proceed on their own timetable through a federal framework. How much of it was authentic opposition and how much of it was, more like cynical, trying to control the industry rather than oppose it?
Well, a couple thoughts there, Dan. It's, number one, of course, let's not forget the op-ed piece that Adam Silver wrote in the New York Times, in which he called for the repeal of PASPA and the legalization of sports betting, right? And spoke of, the need to turn the page and come into the internet era and take it out of the shadows and into the sunlight and all that sort of stuff, right? And that preceded the Supreme Court's decision by a number of years. But yes, despite that op-ed piece, the NBA was still on the other side of the issue in the New Jersey litigation. And, to some extent, the sports leagues had been opposed to sports betting for so long. It was very hard, I think, for them to all of a sudden not be opposed to it anymore, right? And to some extent, I think the Supreme Court just got them out of the box that they had put themselves into with their opposition, because it was hard. They'd been making these arguments for decades. And it wasn't too long before the Supreme Court's decision when the commissioners, they testified under oath about the terrible harm that would befall the leagues if, sports betting somehow became legal. And, so we went from that to, within the last, year or two, FanDuel and DraftKings and Caesars being official sports betting partners of the NFL.
Not only that, but if you're going to go to the Super Bowl next year in Glendale, Arizona, you're going to have to really avert your eyes to avoid the MGM Sportsbook at the stadium, which is going to be hosting the Super Bowl. I mean, did you ever imagine back in 2016 when you were licking your wounds from the latest loss in Christie 2, that 5-6 years later, you'd be going to a Super Bowl game where there was a sportsbook at the stadium?
Yeah, I mean, and of course, you look what exists already in Washington, D.C. at the Capital One Arena. In the Caesars Sportsbook now, it's Caesars Sportsbook with, Ted Leonsis, of course, one of the most visible owners. Ted owns both the Capitals and the Wizards, who's been, very positive on sports betting for a while. So, look, the leagues have their own internal dynamics and how they all work. So I wouldn't want to try to guess what was going on in their minds. But, very clearly, they were in a box from the opposition for so long, from the, sworn statements under oath. And, Gary Bettman, who I've got great affection for, Gary was asked, what changed your mind on sports betting? And he says the Supreme Court. Right. So, it really is fascinating to see just how quickly the leagues that fought it for so long have now actively embraced it. And I think there's a lot of positive that's come from that.
Joe, I think you said something perfect about the sports leagues, that they have been opposed to sports gambling and sports betting for so long that it's almost like they're afraid of change, or they don't want it. I want to make a comparison here. I think it's very similar to certain states, right? Like New York was so opposed to it, even after PASPA fell. New York was one of the states that everyone thought was going to jump right into it, and it didn't happen that way. And then we just saw recently where there was a lawsuit that New York filed, the Attorney General's office filed against DraftKings and FanDuel. And then they had to flip it completely on its head, where then they were defending the lawsuit that just came out, White versus Cuomo, which was attacking daily fantasy sports. So you have this interesting dynamic of somebody who has been, like you said, so opposed. Where do you see certain states or certain states in that similar situation now, where they have been opposed for it so long that it's just not, they're not able to agree or come to some sort of agreement on a bill where they can actually approve this?
Well, look, I'm not sure that you have a lot of states, and certainly none of the major ones that I can think of, where, the legislators are necessarily opposed to sports betting, right? I mean, I think now there's such a positive sentiment around it. The daily fantasy lawsuits in New York and elsewhere, I think that was a little bit different, right? Because the issue there was just whether or not the conduct that was happening was legal or illegal under the existing law at the time, versus, the broader policy question of, should sports betting be legal? And, now so much of it is, even when I think there's general support for sports betting, the question becomes, well, what does the bill look like? How does it happen, right? Who gets the licenses? Do the incumbent casinos get licenses? Do sports teams get licenses? Are there licenses at large for online operators and so forth? And, and then in California, you have the question of, well, what do you do in California where, the tribes have long held certain gaming rights in the state, and how does sports betting fit into that system? So you've got two referenda that appear to be going before the voters, right? One, the online bill championed by a number of online gambling companies, and the tribes and racetracks retail only bill, that the tribes are behind. Florida, of course, you had the compact with the Seminoles that wound up falling to federal court challenge. So it's not really a question of, for or against sports betting as much as, how's it going to work in the given state? There may be exceptions to that, I suppose. We'll see how things play out in Texas, where there's, a lot of jockeying around and so forth. But, look, I'm of the view that one day sports betting is going to be legal in all 50 states, right? I won't give you a date, so you can't say I was wrong. But, I do think there's widespread public support for it.
Why do you think Utah will join the group? Because the conventional wisdom is it's going to be 49 states, but not Utah, maybe not Hawaii, but you've long said it's going to be all 50 states. What's the impetus to make it happen in a conservative state like Utah, where there's very traditional religious viewpoints and objection to gambling in general?
Yeah, look, Kansas is a pretty conservative state, right? They just passed a sports betting bill. Utah has professional sports teams. The casinos in Wendover do a pretty good business, and those are all folks coming over from the greater Salt Lake City area. So, again, I'm not putting a date on it, but I just think that people like to bet on sports. Sports continues to take up a greater and greater and greater share of thought in the American culture. And it's really just become bigger and bigger, right? The NFL is just a juggernaut. It's almost a year-round business now. I mean, look at all the people who came to Vegas for the draft, and it was a multi-day, media special, covering the draft. I mean, is it real exciting to watch, the third round and see who's going to be picked, midway through the pack in the third round? But yet, it's become a big thing where people tune in. And, Tom Brady retired, unretired now, and all that stuff. And he's, standing on the middle of pitch, at Old Trafford after a Manchester United game with Ronaldo. And just the pervasiveness of sports in the culture. I think one of the things about sports is people they have an opinion on the outcome, and then they want to back their opinion for a reason. A lot of it is just validation on being right. I mean, we're in the midst, of the NBA and the NHL playoffs as we're recording this, and it's a way for the fan to just get a little bit more engaged in it. So I don't think of any state as being a lost cause when it comes to the legalization of sports betting.
Transition from that topic and connect the fan engagement to the sports teams beginning to want direct involvement in the state ecosystem. Now, you negotiate the very first, I guess, in-arena sportsbook deal with Ted Leonsis and Monumental Sports. But from my understanding, that was like a landlord, tenant type situation where the team and its ownership were not directly sharing in the revenues or any direct participation. Now we're beginning to see in states like Ohio, Maryland, Arizona, Missouri, where sports teams are either being granted or it's proposed to grant teams actual licenses, whether it's in their name or they get to control who their mobile sports betting provider is. So do you see this intensification of team level involvement in the sort of operator process? Do you see that as a good thing or natural outgrowth of the expansion of sports betting? Are there any negatives associated with that? Or do you think that that's a good thing overall because it builds the retail business and it brings more customers into the fold?
Well, look, and the Arizona Coyotes got one of the licenses in Arizona, and they're operating, they've called it Sahara Bets. It's a different legal entity, but they're both owned by Alex Morello. He made the decision to not partner with an existing operator, but to operate himself. And he happens to be using the IGT platform to do it, which is, which is great for our business. And it gives, and anybody who knows Alex knows he's a very smart guy. So he's, put a lot of thought into it. Look, I think you'll see most teams partner with somebody, as Ted did in DC and, as the Arizona Cardinals have done. And you mentioned with MGM, the FanDuels and the Sun Stadium and so forth. So look, I think you can get into, very particular questions around, should they be able to have betting on their games? And I remember back at Riviera, a fellow who owned the Milwaukee Bucks also had an ownership interest in the Riviera. And so the Riviera could not take bets on the Bucks games. And I think presently the Silverton here in Las Vegas, they have the LA Lakers games off the board. I think that's almost pointless because everybody knows what the line is. Yeah, they're just going to go bet it somewhere else. But if you want to have some controls around that type of stuff, I think fine. But, I think the broader opportunity, for teams is this engagement that you spoke about.
Speaking of which, congratulations on the deal with the Coyotes. There's almost no chance that franchise will ever leave Arizona. I mean, one of the few states that grants professional sports teams a license for both in-person betting and online betting. I mean, he would play in a movie theater if it meant staying in Arizona. So I always found that interesting when he ran into some of those lease issues with, I think it was the city of Glendale and what he's going to do next. Under no circumstances is he ever going to leave the state of Arizona. He has something so few other professional sports team owners have. And certainly in the NHL, he's probably one of just a couple of teams that have that right.
Look, the arena, Glendale's a tough spot for a hockey arena, right? It's one thing, for folks to trek out to Glendale for the football games, 8 or 9 weekends a year. When you have a sport with 40 home games to trek out to Glendale from where, a lot of the fan base lives is pretty tough. So, moving to Tempe and, there's the sort of the temporary tendency to use the arena at the college there while something else is built. I mean, I think that's ultimately going to be a very positive transition for the Coyotes. And of course, they're going to be loaded up, with a lot of high draft picks as well.
6 years from now, they're going to pan out. You and I are both, major hockey fans, but these 18-year-olds, it takes like 3-4 years for them to kind of ripen into decent players. I mean, you watch the Rangers. I mean, it took Kakko, he's in his third year and he hasn't quite popped yet. So I admire the rebuilding plan, but it's going to take a while, I think.
Well, look, Alex, his first venture into the casino industry is when he bought the Grand Sierra in Reno, which had a Lucky's Sportsbook, which was the company that I sold to William Hill. So, I've known Alex since, he got into the casino business. And if you've seen what he's done there from taking a property that was losing a lot of money and turning it into one that's hugely profitable, you'd never bet against the guy. I would just never bet against the guy. And, I was down at the Sierra a couple of days ago, and the transformation at the property under his ownership is really striking. If you want to bet against the Coyotes in the long term, you better do so at your own peril.
All right, I'll remember that, and I have no expertise in the area of knowing his track record, so I'll take your word for it. So let's go from that success to back to the situation in California. You've long made known your love and affection for Del Mar Racetrack, and you spend your summers at Del Mar. I'm wondering when we're going to get the announcement that Del Mar is going to partner with IGT for sports betting in California, because I want to kind of use that to frame the debate around California that you alluded to a few minutes ago. And I want to get into it in a little while, but I think you're like the perfect partner for Del Mar when they go live, if and when they go live next year.
Well, look, we'll see what happens with the referenda. There's no deal with that IGT is involved in currently with Del Mar, but they have been working with somebody else who I know quite well. But we'll see how it plays out. I mean, I really don't know how this referendum is going to play out. I mean, it's possible that both pass, possible that one pass, possible, of course, that zero pass. I mean, that's going to be up to the voters in California. And, obviously there's going to be quite a bit of money that's spent in advance of the election this year in California. I'm going to be out in Del Mar this summer, looking forward to opening day. In fact, I was talking about Del Mar, just a few minutes before we're recording this. It's a great place. I certainly do love going out there. One day we'll see what the voters say, but you could very well have a sports book at Del Mar, and I'm sure it'll be a great one.
Will they require sport jackets and long sleeve shirts? I read up on the dress code. I couldn't believe that in the summertime you have to wear a sports jacket.
Well, in the turf club, if you go to, I never go to the turf club. I couldn't be bothered to wear a jacket, going to Del Mar. I mean, I show up in a polo shirt and shorts and sit outside. But if you want to go into the turf club, you do have to get dressed up.
Yeah, at the risk of alienating some stakeholder in the industry, do you have a preference as to which of the two initiatives pass?
I think that's, we'll see what the voters decide. I mean, that's obviously going to be up to the people to decide. And there's going to be no shortage of campaign spending to encourage them to vote one way or the other.
How about no shortage of litigation? One of the issues I see surfacing, and I think the tired narrative is that, when you have two initiatives, you really have none. It's like mutually assured destruction. I kind of see things from the other vantage point. And what happens if they both pass? I mean, they both have appealing characteristics. The online initiative could raise $500 million or more annually for homelessness. And of course, on the retail initiative, it's something that the tribes are very good at in California. They're very good at campaigning. Back in 1998, they passed Proposition 5, and in 1999, they passed Proposition 1A, each time with over 60% of the vote. So I can't imagine that the tribes will fail. The question is whether the online sports betting initiative will also clear the 50% threshold. And then the question I have for you is, what do you see ensuing if they both pass? Can they coexist together, or do you think there'll be litigation?
Short answer is I don't know. Given the country we live in and the proclivity for litigation, you'd expect there to potentially be some litigation, no matter what happens, I suppose, or if one of the two pass. And to how that might work, I think we just have to wait and see. You have tribal gaming is such an important part of the economy in California. And look, let's not forget, the origins around tribal gaming and what Congress, the rights that Congress chose to grant, in that area. And I think that kind of gets lost in, the modern day view of it. And, sports betting, look, I live in Nevada where there's mobile sports betting. I've got 4 apps on my phone, and, it's pretty easy, for me to make a bet, whenever I might want to make a bet, and to do it in a legal and regulated way. And that of course is a positive thing. How things play out in California, I think it's anybody's guess. And look, I mean, I had somebody tell me recently that, given the public sentiment around politics these days, and, inflation and war in Russia and Ukraine, that it's hard to get a yes vote for anything. So no way anything's going to pass, just, negative voter sentiment. And I've had somebody tell me the exact opposite. Oh yeah, people in California, they're seeing the national advertising and Peyton and Eli Manning and Archie Manning and Cooper and Halle Berry and JB Smoove and all those Caesars commercials. And they want to know how come they can't do it as well. because you can do it in Nevada, you can do it in Arizona, and so forth. So, you talk to different people, you'll get completely diametrically opposed opinions on the topic. And, we'll find out in a number of months what happens.
Yeah, I mean, the issue that I'm tracking, assuming they both pass, before we move on to the next topic, the issue that I'm really intrigued about is whether the two initiatives are in conflict with one another. And then that's going to set up a legal battle over whether they're in conflict, which aspects of the retail are in conflict with certain aspects of the mobile, vice versa. And it could set up a little bit of a delay in trying to sort through that, because I think when you go out and have a choice as to how, when, and where to make a wager, maybe there's an inherent conflict between should you bet on your mobile device or drive somewhere and bet in person. And then there's some language in the tribal initiative that, at least in my mind, raises issues as to whether there's a conflict. And if there's a conflict, then they both can't pass. So that's sort of the forward-thinking issue that I'm focusing on, but it assumes that both pass, and most people are taking the view that both will not pass.
Hopefully one day we can make a bet at Del Mar Racetrack, and I'll get out there, the first day it's legal, and hopefully you'll join me.
As the operator?
No, just as a fan. I mean, I go as a fan, love to go there every summer, as you pointed out.
I think just before the transition, I think to get to where you want to be, which is all 50 states, right? All 50 states have legalized sports betting. And I agree with you. I think we'll get there and time will tell. I think the world, but the United States was shocked after January of this year when New York finally went live, and they did just about 2 billion in the first month of wagers. And I think BetMGM a couple months ago estimated that if California goes live, it'll push the North American market to somewhere around 37 billion. So I think to your credit here, to get to that 50 mark, I think if California goes live in one way or the other, that it will definitely, other states will likely fall or see the value that they're gaining from it. But another issue that we see is college sports and whether or not, and depending on the state and the legislation, whether or not you can bet on colleges, or if they limit it to betting on colleges within your own state or outside of your state, preventing you. And now we have the world of name, image, and likeness and student athletes. And you talk about the vulnerability of student athletes. You have this old scene of a bookie walking up to a student athlete being like, hey, like miss a few free throws or something like that, right? You have all these people who don't want betting on college sports. And now you have name, image, and likeness. And I just want to kind of get your take on the current landscape of college betting and where it's going to go moving forward.
A lot in that question. Well, a couple things. So number one, I don't like this idea that, we're going to have betting on pro sports, but not on college, because, customers are not going to bet with, a legal bookmaker for pro when they still have to bet, with the illegal bookie for college. And so I think that is a counterproductive way to approach it. And, the no betting on in-state teams, I'm not a fan of that either. Though, look, that's the law in New Jersey, and the effort to change it failed. So, you have to obviously ultimately respect the will of the voters. But, the idea that, that bookie is walking up to some college kid and saying, hey, I mean, whether you can bet in-state or not, that risk is still there, right? I mean, if somebody's trying to get into cahoots with a college athlete in New Jersey, but he can't bet on the team in New Jersey, well, you just go across the river into Manhattan or into Pennsylvania. So, the idea that there's any real, integrity benefit to, these in-state school exceptions, I just don't agree with that at all. When you had the point shaving, scandals in college basketball 30, 40 years ago, that came to light because of unusual betting activity that was reported by Las Vegas bookmakers. And that's how it came to light to begin with. So I don't think you should have those, prohibitions on betting on college, since, people clearly love to bet on college sports. Now, the name, image and likeness stuff, boy, oh boy, is that. I mean, all you got to do is listen to Nick Saban and Jimbo Fisher go at it. And, that's clearly changing the landscape around college sports in a pretty big way. Look, for so long, these athletes have been creating tremendous value for the schools, getting tuition and room and board. Okay, fair enough. But, nowhere commensurate, to the value that they're creating. And of course, now they can participate in that value. I think that's a whole, sort of separate discussion from the sports betting aspect of it.
I think I know the answer to this, but do you see the future of college sports being involved with sports books? Do you see stadiums being named after the sports books and having live sports books in stadiums on colleges?
Well, I mean, William Hill had a deal with UNR and with UNLV when I was there. We did deals with them. I remember reading it. PointsBet had done some deal in Colorado when it was the first time, and it wasn't because of William Hill had done these deals in Nevada. And by the way, at one point in time, Nevada had that rule where, you couldn't have UNLV games on the board. And then, I don't know how long ago it was, 15, 20 years ago, that rule went away and you could bet on them. So, and I think we had the William Hill logo on the scorers table at Running Rebel games at one point, and it was in the arena. So, that sort of stuff I think is already there. Look, I think it's, tricky to have a sports book, on a college campus, just because you get into the underage gaming issues. And, as an operator, I think you'd be pretty sensitive around that. But in terms of advertising and the general brand awareness and so forth, that's already going on. And I think that just continues. And I think that Caesars do a deal with LSU, if I'm not mistaken.
Advertising kind of broaches the question of what's going on in Massachusetts at the moment. Massachusetts is, or at least on the Senate side of things, they proposed some very stringent guidelines for advertising by sportsbooks. I believe the Senate bill proposes a whistle-to-whistle ban on sportsbook ads that begins 5 minutes before a live telecast, continues through and including the end, plus 5 minutes after, and it would apply to the live televised events as well as the streaming of sporting events, as well as there being a sort of a limited ban on in-stadium and in-arena sportsbook ads. So when you take these proposed guidelines on top of what could be a very high tax rate of 35% and limited market access in a state like Massachusetts, which is proposing maybe no more than 12 licenses, can you talk about the challenges that pose to the industry as a whole and the dangers or potential downsides of having, minimal sportsbook advertising during a game?
Well, look, I mean, this whole topic around advertising can almost have a whole separate podcast around it. And there have been pretty significant advertising restrictions imposed in Europe. So it's actually not a surprise that somebody's even talking about it now in the U.S. The way they are in Massachusetts. The difficulty at the start of the market, of course, is advertising is important to alert the public at large that, they now have legal options, how they can bet, right? We know it, right? Because we work in the industry and close to the industry and we're highly attuned to it, but a lot of people, they just don't know. Right. They just don't know. I mean, and they, in fact, I was back east over spring break, had dinner with someone in my wife's family. He had an account with an illegal offshore bookmaker and he had no idea it was illegal. He just thought sports betting was legal in Pennsylvania. And he didn't know that the company that he was betting with was illegal. And I'm not going to mention them because I don't want to give them any free advertising. But general public, they just don't know. And so if you prohibit advertising or limit advertising, you make it harder to educate the public on this legal regulated option that is going to generate tax revenue for the state. So that's clearly one of the arguments for it. It's also pretty obvious to me anyway that there's going to be an increase in people developing gambling problems as a result of the legalization of sports betting, because sports books are advertising their product and it's good advertising, right? They're spending lots and lots of money on it, and how many times have we seen Jamie Foxx in the fountains of the Bellagio and the Mannings and so forth. And so it's inevitable that, more people will bet, and that'll lead to, more people developing a gambling problem and having the problems that flow from that and negatively impacting their families and so forth. And so, I think it's important that everybody, be very cognizant of that. Striking the right balance around that is incredibly difficult. And it's actually made more difficult by the fact that, we operate on a state by state basis, and gambling historically has been left to the states to decide. And so if you have one set of rules with respect to Massachusetts sports betting, Well, what do you do on Rhode Island's just to the south? There's no such restriction. So it's pretty complicated. One of the reasons why there was I remember hearing a regulator complain about, if there's too much advertising and if the operators don't do something about it, we will. Okay, that's nice and easy to say, but look at how many operators are licensed. And, I was in Delaware at the beginning of the NFL season last year. And I was watching the Sunday night game in my hotel room. And, it was the Philadelphia TV station that I was watching in Delaware. And, there might have been one or two commercials for Caesars and one or two for MGM and one or two for FanDuel and one or two for DraftKings. There was one for Win, and there was one for Bet Rivers, and there was one for PointsBet, right? It's all these different operators, right? It's not any one operator that was causing the problem. It's the fact that there were so many operators, and the issue wasn't the content of the advertising, it was just the cumulative effect of all the advertising. How do you say, company A or company B should do something different in that environment when it wasn't any one company that was doing something problematic? Where I do have an issue with advertising is any sort of advertising, that gets directed to children, for instance, right? My kids happen to watch Dude Perfect videos on YouTube. And, that tends to get, quite a few younger viewers. I don't think sports betting companies should be advertising in videos where there's such a big proportion of the viewership is going to be minors, but that's a whole separate, point of it. But anyway, this, the advertising questions and thoughts and where we go on this stuff, you could go on for a long time on.
Before we go to our lightning round and do quick hit topics on, Las Vegas, the Oakland A's, Raiders, Gerard Gallant, and so forth, I want to ask you one more question about a policy issue relating to sports betting and seeing some of the tax rates, spike up in certain jurisdictions. I remember when you testified in front of the New York State Senate Gaming, Wagering, and something else committee. I forgot the exact name, but you gave a tutorial to the committee members about sportsbook profits and tried to explain how profits end up being determined. And it was a very narrow profit margin with a lot of risk being thrown onto the sportsbook. So how do you react to the recent spate of jurisdictions that now are beginning to tax sportsbook operators either through competitive bidding or in a just straight tax rate at 51% in Rhode Island and New Hampshire, which were competitively bid situations, but now Massachusetts is proposing 35%, Pennsylvania's at 34%, and we have so many of these large states remain high taxing states for sportsbook operators. So how do you respond to that? And what can you tell lawmakers in Massachusetts about how to approach this issue?
Well, when you look at it with the fact that one of the advantages to legalizing sports betting is to try to supplant the illegal market, you have to be cognizant of the fact that the illegal market pays 0% in taxes, right? They're criminals. They're not paying taxes, right? They may be operating offshore. It might be the corner bookie, like my dad's bookie in Wilmington back in the day. The higher you make the tax rate, the harder it is for the legal market to supplant it. Now, what you've seen in the early days of New York, for instance, was, the massive advertising around sports betting. Friends were telling me all about it, the sign-up offers that you were getting. I mean, I think at one point Caesars had the $3,000 deposit match, and if you knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody, you could get even more kind of thing. And that's obviously been ratcheted back. But, I saw it in Arizona. I was out in Arizona for a kids' soccer tournament with my son. And, the advertising was all throughout my Facebook and Twitter feeds with, $1,000 sign-up offers and so forth. In the interim, you've had the stock market really, take a cleaver to the valuations of sports betting companies, as well as people start to focus on profitability, coming from sports betting companies. And so, it's clearly harder to compete with the illegal market, harder to be profitable. That ultimately will affect operations. But, look, the companies who pursued a license and bid the 51% in New York, they're all big boys and they all knew what they were doing. And so, maybe over time they try to lobby for a change to that. But, the very easy rejoinder was, well, you signed up for it. So it's tough. It's pretty rare when taxes go down in the gambling industry, right? It does happen. It does happen, but it's pretty rare, right? They usually go in the opposite direction.
Joe, you've been for now, a relatively long time Las Vegas resident. The city has transformed into a sports mecca. Now you have Las Vegas Golden Knights, the Las Vegas Raiders, and possibly the Las Vegas Athletics. Can you talk about the sports environment in Nevada and in particular, your support of the Golden Knights?
Well, the Las Vegas A's, we'll see how that plays out. It's kind of one of these on again, off again sort of things. Although I read an article today that suggested, there might be some effort between the government and the A's to try to make it work. But Golden Knights, it's just been great from Las Vegas. I wasn't a particularly big hockey fan. I wasn't a hockey fan at all. I'd go to a game, here and there once a year just for something to do. Golden Knights come to town.
I see you on the ice all the time, posing for photos. I mean, you are like probably one of the most synonymous or recognizable supporters of the Golden Knights. So what flipped the switch for you?
Yeah, I think I caught the Golden Knights fever when they came to town. It was great. Everybody really got into it. Of course, that first year was the magical season, and then you start to become a fan of the game. All credit. Jim Murin doesn't get nearly the credit he deserves for bringing the Golden Knights to Las Vegas, but he was the guy who was in Gary Bettman's ear way back when and telling him that, Las Vegas would support a team. I was at the Target earlier today, and it was the same Target where, a couple of years ago, William Karlsson, who's a forward for the Golden Knights, was shopping one day. And it was like, the Beatles at JFK Airport, I think. I mean, I heard about it from so many people that, Karlsson was shopping at the Target. Yeah, Vegas really got into hockey. They really rallied around the team. I think the decision to fire Gerard Gallant was just an atrocious decision. He's the toast of the town in New York these days. And, the Rangers are in a position to make a really good run. And it's great seeing them behind the bench and, teamed up again with Ryan Reeves, who, of course, was a great fan favorite here in town. In Las Vegas, it was a very disappointing year for the Golden Knights. I find it a little bit inconsistent that they fired DeBoer, but not McCrimmon. But, that's obviously, the owner's choice. All the while, the Golden Knights are out of the playoffs and, and Gerard Gallant's toast of the town in New York City.
I wouldn't underestimate the change that Ryan Reeves has brought about within that locker room. His pregame speeches are like appointment viewing. The way he gets the team, focused and motivated and just so charged up. One of the best individuals I've ever seen in a locker room with those pregame speeches. But I think Gallant's strength is that he knows to give the players control over their own locker room. New York's had coaches in the past like John Tortorella, David Quinn. They just kind of sucked all the oxygen out of the room because they had to be sort of the alpha male. I mean, Gerard Gallant comes walking in and you just know he is. He doesn't have to prove a point. And I think he automatically earns respect the moment he walks into that locker room, and he gives the players the freedom and the rope to make mistakes and not feel as if they're going to be benched for 2 or 3 games. And, occasionally he has to send a message. But in my lifetime of watching Rangers hockey, I think he's been one of the most effective coaches that I've seen come across the pike. I mean, just consider where they were last year, not in the playoffs. And now this year, 110 points or whatever they have, they're in the second round, and maybe they have a shot at making the conference finals. So I think that's a lot of credit to Gerard Gallant. But what went wrong for him in Las Vegas? I can't figure it out. He took an inaugural team to the finals.
Look, I think a lot of people are still trying to figure it out. The best guess anybody gives you, of course, is that DeBoer was available, and having been fired in San Jose, it was just sort of the shiny new toy. And the fact that they fired him like 2 weeks before he was going to coach the All-Star game for the first time in his career on the road in Ottawa, as I recall. It was a complete head scratcher and something I disagreed with at the time, and, obviously disagree with, to this day. And I'm a big Gallant fan. I really like him. It's funny, that time I was on 60 Minutes, we actually recorded this segment at the New Jersey Devils Arena. It was the night that the Golden Knights were playing the Devils that day, and I happened to be looking for a bathroom to find a place to tie my tie, and I ran into Gallant as he was in the locker room. I kind of stumbled by mistake into the Golden Knights locker room. I've just been a big fan, and I'm just tickled pink that he's doing well in New York.
Well, you're welcome to join the New York Rangers bandwagon at any time. There's no quit in New York, and hopefully
I had him last night. I had him yesterday. I thought coming back, to New York, they were plus 105. I bet him yesterday at Circa, so I was pretty happy with that result.
All right. Before we close out, and maybe Mike will have a question too, but I want to ask you some kind of quick hit questions that I've always wondered about the New Jersey sports betting litigation. If you can't answer, I'll understand. But were you really going to launch a sports book at Monmouth Park Racetrack in October of 2014 if the leagues hadn't sued? I remember there was that sort of game of chicken. You were running these commercials, and you were going to be operating under this like partial repeal law where, you were going to have the, sold out Monmouth Park Racetrack, and William Hill operated Sportsbook. And of course, the leagues file suit in court a couple of days before that, and they seek a motion for a temporary restraining order, preliminary injunction. Can we finally get at the truth of whether that was ever off?
Yeah, it's a great question. You got a good memory to remember all that. We had people on the scene, helping to set up everything, whether or not we were ever going to actually take a bet. I don't think we had ever made a final decision around that, but, we were certainly setting it up.
Well, I think that created the sort of the opening for the leagues to seek emergency injunctive relief. You needed an immediate threat of injury. So my theory all these years is that this was just nothing more than a legal tactic to tee the issue up for emergency injunctive relief and put it on a fast track to the appellate court, because without it, maybe the leagues don't sue right away. I don't know. Am I out of left field on that? Was this?
No, you're not out of left field, other than in supposing that there was harm that would befall the leagues had they actually taken bets. I think the subsequent history clearly proves that was not the case.
Okay. Another question related to that. If the Supreme Court had decided the issue on narrow grounds statutorily and said that this partial repeal law was valid and that the league's, attempted use of PASPA to override it was a non-starter because it wasn't an affirmative authorization and didn't fit within any of the prohibitions under PASPA, would you have been ready to operate a sports book in an unlicensed environment? Would that have been something you were prepared to do if you had won on those narrow grounds?
We never thought it was going to turn out on such a narrow basis. And even before the argument, I thought that was, once they took the case, it was hard for me to see why take the case to try to come up with some really narrow argument. And then, of course, the Chief Justice's question at the oral argument to the lawyer representing the DOJ, I think it was pretty obvious they were never going to rule in such a narrow fashion.
I've got a pitch for you. I mean, when you talk about the history, think about where sports betting is today, and it basically rose from sort of the dustbin back in 2016. It was almost dead and buried, and 5-6 years later, look at how this industry has developed. And none of this would have been possible without your contribution, without Dennis Drazen, without Governor Christie's, leap of faith on that partial repeal law. There are probably a small group of people who are singularly responsible for this industry taking off. You're one of them, and that's sort of exemplified by your induction into the Sports Betting Hall of Fame. But I want to take it to the next level.
Well, before you do, I wouldn't put myself in that category at all, and I'm not just being overly humble about it. I mean, Dennis, Governor Christie, Ted Olson, right? They were the real, key people in the whole thing. I think Jeff Freeman, as I mentioned earlier, played such a critical role in the whole thing. I mean, I was there cheering them on and giving my 2 cents and all that kind of thing. But
you had
those
skin
are
in
the
the
guys.
game. No, Joe, you had skin in the game. You invested $1 million in a sports book that looked like a sports bar. And without your financial investment and ongoing support for these efforts, who knows what ultimately would have ever happened? It may have never come to pass. So the idea that I have is, I think there needs to be a Netflix movie. We're going to call it The Wild East. I already have the idea now that I've shared it with thousands of people who are going to be listening to this podcast. I think the story does need to be told someday. You have to be a character in this movie. And why hasn't this story ever been told? Do you think it could be compelling, pitch idea for a Netflix treatment? I think so. I think a series.
Can we get like Christian Bale to play me or something?
I'll tell you what, yes, provided I can play myself and appear in at least one of the episodes. Back when I'm in the Trenton courtroom, or when I'm going up and introducing myself to you for the first time, I think that would be a compelling story if it's done right. I mean, they had that show Lucky on HBO, and that was a very slow burn. And, that was around the Santa Anita situation, and that series came to a close. But when done well, a story or a series on the gambling industry could be very compelling theater. And what's bigger than this story?
Look, it is a great story. And I think, look, think of Ted Olson and all that man has accomplished throughout his illustrious career in life. And, to get a chance to get to know him through this case was such a treat. I'm proud to call him a friend. And, what he's done is just remarkable. I'll always be a Chris Christie fan just from I remember the first, the conversation I had with him after that talk he gave at the University of Delaware. I happened to run into him at the Deer Park Tavern, which is sort of the famous bar restaurant at the University of Delaware. And sure enough, there he was after the event, sitting at the table with the cheeseburger. And, I went up and started talking to him. So, I had a lot of fun, memories flow from all this. Dennis and I got to go to the races at Royal Ascot together with our families, and that was fantastic. So, there's been a lot of neat stuff come out of it for sure.
Is it true that he's a competitor of yours now? You're powering the sports book at the Meadowlands, and he runs Monmouth Park Racetrack. So in a sense, you went from collaborators to now, at least on the professional side, you're somewhat competitive with one another.
Well, it's funny. I hadn't thought about that till you just said it now. We still talk.
Sorry, I impacted your friendship.
No, not at all. I think the world of Dennis. Great guy. And as I say, very smart, very dedicated, a real joy to do business with.
A lot of our audience is, law students and young lawyers who want to get into the field. So you have an incredible background, an incredible career that you've had, and somebody who, came out, you did a clerkship, you worked for Skadden, big law, and then you jumped right into this, at the time, really relatively, niche area. It still is niche, but, very specific area of law of sports betting and has just absolutely watched it blossom into where we are today. So what advice do you have for any young law student, young lawyer who wants to really get into sports betting, sports gambling, into the field?
Yeah, well, and I never really did anything with sports betting when I was a lawyer. Look, I think as with anything, it's about, following your passion, following your interests. I grew up around gambling as a little kid back in Delaware because my dad was a gambler, and started working at the racetrack when I was 16. Decided I wanted to announce horse races. In fact, I still do every Labor Day weekend up at the Elko County Fair in northeastern Nevada. My son and I go up there for that. I think it's all about, really. And so I had this career as a lawyer and then got back into the gambling business. And obviously a legal background is incredibly helpful in the gaming industry because it's such a heavily regulated industry. And it's, of course, been very, very helpful for me, for all the reasons that we just talked about. I think the key is to really follow your passion, learn as much as you can about something, and then look for opportunities to get involved in it. Right. I mean, Dan is a great example of that. Right. I mean, he just decided he was really interested in gambling and sports betting and started writing about it and got known for this, real niche specialty. And so, for any lawyer coming out of law school, my advice, is always, work hard, try to learn the best practices, attention to detail, thoroughness, right? Act with integrity and then just pursue your passion, wherever it may lead you, right? Whether it's sports betting or being a public defender or a prosecutor or, any other, specialty in the law.
Joe, I could really go on all day. I know you probably can't. This has been one of the most fascinating conversations I've had with anybody in the history of conduct detrimental. It's certainly a topic I love talking about, but you're also somebody that I've looked up to for a long time and I've always admired in the industry. And you've had such a multifaceted career, the youngest racetrack announcer in the history of North America, a litigator at Skadden and Arbs. You do your own lobbying and governmental affairs. And usually at these companies, they send their lobbyists to do it, but you go there yourself. And I've admired all the different hats that you've worn in your career in gaming. And I look forward to continuing our conversation in some other forum someday soon. But thank you for being so generous with your time and allowing us to kind of revisit Christie 1, Christie 2, and Murphy and talk about some of the current developments in the sports betting industry. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Joe. And congrats on your Hall of Fame induction.
Yeah, thank you.
So that was Joe Asher, president of IGT Gaming. I thought that was a really great conversation. He's super knowledgeable. I mean, we went through the history of sports gambling and all the way through the future and its connection to pro sports and college sports and advertising. And there's a lot to cover. And I think we did it in well within an hour here, just a little over an hour. But Dan, I wanted to pitch one question to you. He keeps saying it, and he said it before, and he's been quoted on saying it. He says all 50 states are going to have legalized sports gambling. Do you believe him? Do you agree with him?
Yeah, because at some point, he didn't put a time limit on his prediction. If he said by 2024, all 50 states, I'd say no way. But in 3 years or 4 years now, since PASPA was overturned, we've gone from just one state that had single game sports wagering to now, I believe it's 34. So that's a very rapid rate of progression. And there are only 16 states left. I think the only likely holdouts in the short term are going to be states like Utah and Hawaii. And I think it's only a matter of time. And Joe's been proven right time and time again in this space. So I have no reason to doubt or question his prediction. In fact, I agree with it, particularly if you put no time limit on it, because forever is a very long time. And inevitably, the lure of legal sports betting will be too difficult to resist because of the amount of money that's at stake. And of course, he highlighted the fact that Utah has professional sports teams, and the Jazz are probably going to be pushing heavily for it. And there is a lot of good that the revenues from legal sports betting could accomplish in a state like Utah. So if you message it correctly and you create an important public recipient, like it could be in California, they're highlighting homelessness. In Utah, maybe it goes to some important public works organization, or it benefits education, or maybe something. There's a way to message it. And as I said, forever is a long time. So I'm in total agreement with him. When will that happen? Probably not within the next few years, but I would expect by 2030 that Utah would join the fold. And that's not a long shot at all, given the rapid pace at which sports betting has been legalized in states that we wouldn't have even guessed were going to be front runners, like Kansas, Mississippi. Alabama came close to passing it last year. So I think it's a proverbial layup over a longer time horizon.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're getting there. And I think as some of the bigger states go live, we've seen with New York and next California, I think ultimately we will see that. And I definitely agree with that too. And I liked what Joe had to say as some advice for young law students. It's the passion, right? He started, you see he grew up around racetracks and he loved going to racetracks, and he ultimately started announcing for racetracks, and he then became a lawyer and then came back to it. So I think it's admirable there. And I think one of the perfect examples he said is to get into the sports gambling field, you have to be, it's not necessary, but it's helpful to be a lawyer because of a lot of the nuances and the compliance and the regulation. So to that effect, to help you get to become that lawyer, we go into our other sponsor for this episode, Themis Bar Review, right? The bar is coming up now. We have Taryn, who is taking Themis. We've talked about this. Stephanie successfully passed the bar using Themis Bar Review. Head over to themisbar.com/con detrimental, and you can it still has a chance to get a $200 discount using that URL. And if you're a rising 3L and you're looking at getting a bar prep company, again, head over to themisbar.com/con detrimental. And they are definitely the best all around bar prep. And they're going to get you to what Joe said. You got to be a lawyer first and then get you to wherever you want to be and follow your passion.
Well, speaking of passion, Joe alluded to me earlier in highlighting me or pointing me out as an example of somebody who had a lot of passion about the topic. And I'll tell you where that passion came from. I was a lawyer that had an interest in sports law and even sports betting generally, and I took that passion for it and I began writing. And it was sort of the vehicle of writing blog posts and articles basically catapulted me into sort of a position where I became known in the industry and known in the media. But it all began in sort of the blog posts that had no traction or visibility. I was so passionate about it that I couldn't stop. And my incessant amount of writing about the topic eventually developed an audience. And I would invite and encourage anybody who's listening to this podcast, if you're a law student or a lawyer and you want to be able to sort of highlight or showcase your knowledge or passion in a particular industry, come write for us. We accept submissions, voluntary submissions. There are no barriers to entry in this field. And if you want to write for Conduct Detrimental, and you have something unique to say, maybe someday you're going to be that person who's an expert in that area. And it will have started with a blog post at Conduct Detrimental, because I can tell you when I started, my blog posts were on a law firm blog that absolutely nobody read. And it took me a good 6 months before anyone ever noticed. So if you're passionate, relentless, and you have an interest in some particular aspect or segment of sports law, sports betting, you got to start somewhere. And you can't always predict where it's going to lead. But if you're obsessive about it, like I was about sports betting, eventually you'll get noticed and you'll derive a lot of satisfaction from, just the journey. And that was the most exciting thing for me, that once I caught the bug, I couldn't stop. And it was maybe a year before anyone really started quoting me or paying attention to me. But just the satisfaction from finding something that really connected with me was all the motivation I needed. And that could be any of you out there. And now what's available for you is something that wasn't available for me back in the day. A sports law website where your published articles can be read by hundreds, if not a couple thousand people. So please feel free to take advantage of that opportunity. Our doors are always open, and we welcome an expanded Conduct Detrimental family.
Yeah, absolutely. You can DM us, you can reach us on social media, or shoot us an email at conductdetrimental@gmail.com. So Dan Wallach's at Wallach Legal on Twitter. Dan Lust is at Sports Law Lust. Mine, I'm Mike _son_of_law. For everyone at Conduct Detrimental, you can find us at Condetrimental. And if you want to email us, condetrimental@gmail.com. That'll wrap it for us. I think that this is something that Dan and I want to continually have guests who are big players in the sports betting market to keep you up to date with all news coming forward with the legalization and everything that's happening with the legislature. And until next time, we'll see you on another episode of Conduct Detrimental.